Hello, I'm Lynda Kinked. We're going to cover a lot more on the G20 summit in Hamburg. The Russian President Vladimir Putin has just finished speaking. Our international diplomatic editor Nic Robertson was listening into that conversation. And Nic, this press conference comes after the Russian president spent more than 2 hours meeting with US President Donald Trump. And he spoke about President Trump's personality, which is quite an interesting comment. He said Trump on TV is very different to Trump in person. It sounded like Vladimir Putin was left with quite a positive impression.
Yeah, it was intriguing because he also said that on the issue of Russia meddling in the U.S. elections, he said that one of the questions that President Trump asked him was what President Obama what conversations President Obama had with President Putin about that. And he said, well, I wouldn't tell, it wouldn't be diplomatic for me. This is not normal diplomacy for another president to be asking me what the last president asked me on this issue. So he implied that he didn't share that information with President Trump, but he said he also wasn't going to share with the rest of the world precisely what else President Trump discussed with him. But that was a very interesting insight into what he said President Trump had been doing in that meeting, which was trying to find out more about President Obama's role. He said, however, when he told President Trump that he hadn't been involved in the meddling in the U.S. elections, he said, I think he was satisfied by my answers, which seems to be concurrent with what Russian officials were saying yesterday, but denied by the White House. They said that to them that's not their takeaway, that President Trump was satisfied by his answers. But I think the other big thing here that President Putin wanted to speak about, and that came really clearly because of the length and detail that he went into, was the situation in Syria, the cooperation with the United States. He seemed to think that the ceasefire agreed in the southwest of Syria rather is a big deal, and he said he was surprised other people hadn't picked up on it. But there was some very interesting language in there about working with the United States, and I think this may surprise some people, but he said he believes that the U.S. is now taking a more pragmatic approach, that by pooling resources we can be more successful. Well, that didn't come out of the briefing, the off-camera briefing that Secretary of State Rex Tillerson gave about that same meeting yesterday. He didn't say that we're taking a more pragmatic approach towards Russia, that there will be a pooling of resources. He did talk about the possibility of greater cooperation in the future. However, President Putin seems to have taken away significantly more, perhaps, than President Trump has, or perhaps there's yet to be a more substantive readout on that meeting coming from the White House, Lynda.
Yeah, it really did sound like President Putin was quite satisfied with what they've achieved so far at this G20 summit. He also spoke about climate change and also gave some credit to the German Chancellor for being able to get the other 19 countries to continue with the Paris Accord despite the US planning to withdraw.
Sure, and this was something that Angela Merkel, speaking just before him, talked about. You know, one of the things she said going into this G20 was that it's important that essentially we can agree to differ, but if we agree to differ, then we need to write it down. We can't be trying to find some compromise on the Paris climate change agreement. And President Putin and the Kremlin leading up to this have been very clear, positioning themselves with the majority inside that 19, leaving the United States with President Trump outside of the vast majority here. And indeed, Angela Merkel called that position deplorable. She also details some of the other areas and some of the other important items and elements that have come out of the agreements here at the G20. And they also seem to leave the United States on the big principal issues that were concerns going in, leave the United States as a sort of outlier. Trade and globalization, she said, on trade we agreed to fight protectionism. And if we remember her language going into this, that there's a feeling that the United United States is more protectionist with its America First policy. There was a line in there that President Trump will take away, perhaps positively. She said, we want to fight unfair trade. President Trump has said he's not against free trade, which is clearly what Angela Merkel is saying, free trade under the WTO rules. But President Trump says not against free trade, but wants it to be fair trade. Well, a tip of the hat towards that from Angela Merkel. But really what the final communique here, as Angela Merkel outlined it, on the big issues of climate change, on the big issues of change, on the big issues of globalization, the United States is essentially left under President Trump's leadership as an outlier. That is very unusual. The United States would normally be central to the big key issues of agreement here. There was something, you know, there was real concern of a potential trade war escalating if the United States put tariffs or quotas on steel. And she seemed to have found a formula to head off that sort of confrontation. She said by August we'll form a body to look at the issue of steel trade around the world, and by November we'll have a readout from that new body to look at the issue of steel trade, which is something that's key to President Trump. He feels that there is steel dumping that is hurting the U.S. steel industry. So for him, that's a takeaway. But that was a sort of, if you will, an Angela Merkel trying to find a middle road, a middle ground that solved some of the issues and potential disagreement. That, again, that concern about a trade war coming out of the G20, that's clearly been headed off for right now, at least over steel.
All right, Nic Robertson, there's a lot to stay across, certainly there in Hamburg, Germany. Thank you very much. We're going to continue talking about Russian President Vladimir Putin after he gave his remarks at the G20 summit in Hamburg, again denying that his country had any involvement with meddling in the US election. Well, let's get the view from Mr. Putin's speech from our Ivan Watson, who joins us now from Moscow. Ivan, a great deal of time at that press conference was spent talking about Russia's response to those accusations that it meddled in the US election. So much so, someone even almost jokingly asked whether Russia would meddle in the upcoming German election.
Yeah, and I confess I missed his response to that question. But, you know, the reaction here in Moscow to the events of the past 24 hours, to this first historic meeting, has been pretty striking. You've basically had a number of top officials here celebrating this as a breakthrough. You have people in the Russian media, various news outlets saying that, hey, look, this bilateral meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin eclipsed the entire G20 summit. It's the only thing that people are really talking about. Not a big surprise that when Vladimir Putin got up and just gave his press conference, that a lot of it focused on his reactions to his observations of meeting the American president, who he said is very different in person from the Donald Trump that you see on TV. In Vladimir Putin's words, President Trump listens and he answers questions, and he's a good interlocutor. He was pressed on one issue that's been a point of contention, basically, between the two top diplomats from Russia and the U.S. coming out of yesterday's bilateral meeting, and that is whether or not President Trump accepted President Putin's denial of Russian meddling in the November 2016 U.S. election. Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, says that President Trump accepted this denial. And shortly afterwards, a senior White House official, speaking on condition of anonymity to our own Jim Acosta, said that is not true. He did not accept that denial. And when President Putin was asked about this, he said, well, I gave my arguments, and it appears that President Trump accepted it, but you have to ask him. Linda?
Yeah, he certainly did. He put it back on the press to try and ask the White House yet again for President Trump's response there. But the two countries, Russia and the US, also agreed to come together and create a working group to look after cyberspace to prevent future meddling in elections. You have to imagine that there's a lot of skepticism here in the US with that notion of Russia and the US working together. Do you have any other details on how that could work going forward?
Well, Secretary of State Tillerson, coming out of the meeting, said that this would probably, this working group would include the State Department and the Office of the National Security Advisor. But beyond that, we do not have a lot of details, whether this is one working group that would focus on cyber space and a separate working group that would focus on intervention or not. So it does seem like this still very much needs to be worked out. There were a number of other areas where the two leaders spoke about moving forward. One of them was the Ukraine conflict, where the U.S. had agreed to appoint a new special envoy, basically, to help with mediation in that conflict, with negotiating about it. And then, of course, the question of the conflict in Syria, where both sides agreed, along with a third party, that is Jordan, to set up a very local ceasefire situation in the southwest of Syria, around the city of Deraa, where the initial uprising against Syrian President Bashar al-Assad began so many years and so many lives ago. And according to the communiques that were issued, the Russian military police would play a role in helping secure at least the borders of this very local safe zone. The argument from both sides being that, hey, we can start working on cooperating there, and then who knows where that could lead us. A senior lawmaker here in Moscow who has welcomed the results of the last meetings, Lynda, his name is Alexei Pushkov. He spoke on Russian state TV today, and he said that there are probably two realities that Russia is going to have to deal with now. The sanctions that the U.S. has put on Russia since the 2014 annexation of Crimea from Ukraine, and that have been subsequently strengthened after the Obama administration accused Russia of meddling in the 2016 election and seized two Russian diplomatic compounds in the U.S. Those sanctions have yet to be lifted. The pressure will still be applied against Russia. And yet at the same time, there's a second reality where Russia, now after this meeting, can start cooperating with the U.S. in conflict zones like Syria, and we'll just have to see where that goes in the future if more cooperation is possible. But, you know, a lot of this will depend on the reception that President Trump will get when he gets back home to Washington, where there are a number of investigations into alleged collusion with Russia during the election, into alleged meddling, and whether or not he can convince his own party and Congress that it is a good idea to continue cooperating with Russia. Lynda.
Yeah, we'll have to see how that plays out. Ivan Watson, a lot to stay across there from Moscow. Thanks so much.